consider making the move across the border? If so, this webinar is for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing some of the most commonly asked immigration questions that my Canadian clients have. My name is Isa Sanchez, and I'm a licensed realtor here in the state of Florida, and I will be your host for today's webinar. As many of you know, I am a Canadian who transitioned to the United States a few years ago. And like many of you, I did not know where to start my immigration process. And this is where we were referred to a highly qualified attorney who played a pivotal role in our transitioning to the United States. And this is why I strongly believe that aligning yourself with professionals will make any transition smoother. Now, I don't know if you know, but the United States has been the top migration country in the world since 1970. In 2022, more than 126,000 Canadians relocated or migrated to the United States, I should say. And that was a 70% increase from the previous year. The reason why? They vary from better opportunity, economic growth, change of scenery, nicer weather, it all depends. Now, today I've invited a very special guest. He's going to help us navigate through some of these very commonly asked questions that my Canadian clients have. So the webinar will last between 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how quickly we get through the questions. But during this time, I encourage you to take notes and ask questions on the chat, and we will try to get to those questions at the end. Now, please join me in welcoming John Ainsworth. John works for Ainsworth and Clancy, and he is an attorney that specializes in litigation, tax, corporate law, as well as immigration. So he pretty much has you covered from any aspect that you might have. So welcome, John. Thank you for being with us today. Tell us a little bit about you and your company.
Yeah, so we're located in Coral Gables, Florida, which is right outside, well, it's part of Miami. We have 11 attorneys, including me. We have paralegals and support staff as well. I opened the door to the current format of Ainsworth and Clancy in April 2016. And I've been an attorney in Miami since 2012. Before that, I worked in the auto industry in Michigan, where I grew up, in the logistics industry and as a consultant. I did that for 4 years. And before actually living in Michigan, I was born in Canada. I grew up in Brampton, and we moved to Michigan when I was about 8 years old. So third grade is when I moved to Michigan.
So here we have another fellow Canadian that's helping us help other Canadians. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't still have the Canadian accent, as you can tell, but I really, I remember growing up in Canada, playing street hockey, incessantly, and just, I remember growing up in Brampton.
Excellent, excellent. So I want to start this by asking you, what is the most common mistake that people make when they try to migrate to the United States? Before we get into the very legal aspects, I just want to have an understanding of what is the most common mistake.
Well, I think the biggest mistake that people make is they come and they think that they can do whatever they want. So in general, if somebody comes here as a visitor, that Canadians do not need, visitor visas, which is a nice benefit. And Canadians can also stay here for up to 6 months on the stay that they come here for. But then people don't really know, what is it can I exactly do while I'm here? And so that's when one thing that somebody may not know, for example, when you're coming here as a visitor, you cannot work for a Canadian company from the US for an extended period of time. Even if you're working for a Canadian company, even if you're receiving your salary in Canada, you can't simply just come here and work for 2 months from your apartment that you own. Because the way that, our government looks at it is, first of all, we tax you based on where you're providing the services from. So if you're physically providing services from the United States, technically you should be actually taxed on that amount. However, you can't be taxed on that amount because you don't have work authorization because you're a visitor. So, I think the issue is not a big issue if you're coming here for a couple days or a week and it's a vacation. But people who are coming here for extended periods of time and they start to remote work, it could be an issue, later down the road. And I think another thing that people don't really know is they think because they get a 6-month stay that they can just leave and come right back and get another 6 months. Well, that may happen. So like, let's say you come here 6 months and then you leave and you for a week and you come back. And let's say no, that officer at the border doesn't ask, or if you fly in, that officer doesn't ask, and they give you the 6 months. You try to do that one more time, they may just deny your entry because they think that you're using your visitor status as a green card or as permanent residence, and they're not wrong. And the moment that you get denied entry, then it's just a downward spiral for a very long time trying to rectify that situation. So then we have to send you to go get a visitor visa stamp at one of the consulates located in Canada, the US consulates or the embassy. And they're going to be looking at you with a fine-tooth comb as to why do you need to spend a full year in the United States? And they start to uncover things, like maybe you were working remotely at that time. And boom, next thing you know, you can never come back to the United States. And so it's just not worth it. It's really good to understand what you can and cannot do when you come here as a visitor.
Yeah, and this is why we have you today to help us understand some of those rules and regulations that we need to follow to make sure that we do not make a mistake. So thank you. Now, as an immigration lawyer, have you seen an increase in Canadians wanting to transition to the United States lately?
Definitely. Basically, during and post-pandemic, the amount of Canadians that are coming to the United States is, as you cited it, I didn't actually know that citation, but I feel it because before the pandemic, I would travel to Ontario and try and meet people and, make, connections with people who may know people who are coming down, like accountants, advisors, etc. And really, there was almost no traction of people, trying to move here. The only reason people would move here would be because of out of business necessity. So I have a logistics company. The next thing that makes most sense is I want to grow a US branch, et cetera, et cetera. And nowadays, it's just anybody who they're like, hey, I want to leave. How do I do this?
Yeah, I understand that. Now, that will lead me to my second question, which is, what are some of the main reasons why people are seeking to move to the United States? What are you hearing?
So I think probably a big driver is economic. In particular, in Florida, we have a low tax regime because, yes, we have federal income tax, but we don't have a personal state income tax. So, and not every state is like that. So like New York has state and city as well, right? Well, we don't even have a state income tax. So you have lower tax regime here in a place like this or Tennessee or Texas. You also, in Florida, in Miami in particular, or Southeast Florida, you have people coming from all over the world. So there's constant growth in Southeast Florida that is really good for business. So if you want to come and grow a business, this really is a good place to do it, I would say.
Well, and we've seen it recently as well. Companies such as Microsoft and Apple and Blackstone, they're moving their offices to South Florida, right? They understand.
And one thing a big trend I did see was the financial companies from New York.
Yes.
Maybe they don't fully move, but they open up a satellite office. And what they do is they'll get a smaller office at like a WeWork or a Regus.
Yeah.
So that their local team can work 2-3 days a week from the office and then from home. And they let the people move down that want to avoid all of those exorbitant taxes in New York City.
Yeah.
So I noticed that a lot. And that started just before the pandemic and it just accelerated during the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah, it's the growth that Florida is experiencing is just exponential. Now, Florida has always been a top destination for snowbirds, but are you seeing a different trend lately?
Definitely. It's not just snowbirds, it's people who want to live here, like we discussed, Canadians that want to live here. But not just that, being in Miami, we have Europeans, we have people from the UK, Spain, France, Italy, we have Russians, we have people from all over Latin America, from Mexico all the way down to Argentina and everywhere in between.
Yeah.
And so, you know, essentially everybody's coming here.
Canadians are the number 2 investors right now in the state of Florida. Colombians are number 1 and Canadians are number 2. So we're doing well. We're doing well. Now
Definitely.
let's get a little bit more technical. Can anyone from Canada move to the United States, or are there certain rules and regulations that they have to abide by?
Yeah, so I mean, generally, you can come here as a visitor, as we discussed. So you can, purchase a property that you're going to use 2, 3, 4, 5 months out of the year, no problem, and then be back and forth as a visitor, as long as you're not violating any of the work authorization rules,
Mhm.
no problem there. If there's someone wants to be here, to be able to work from here or to build a business or just retire here, then you need a visa. And generally there are two types. So the first type is non-immigrant visas or non-green cards. And then you have immigrant visas, which are green cards or permanent residence. So immigrant, green card, and permanent residence is all the same thing, just said differently.
Okay.
And then the step before that is non-immigrant visas. So generally, the green cards take, let's just say, 2 to 3 years, generally. There are some that are faster, but generally 2 to 3 years. Whereas certain non-immigrant work visas or investor visas could be 2 to 6 months, right? So if you want to come down here quickly and you have a business idea or a company wants to contract you and things line up where it meets your profile, the investment profile, and or the company needs, then you may be able to get here on the non-immigrant visa, get that going, and then once that you really like it, then you start thinking about the next step potentially. But
Yeah.
I would also say that there's no real need to go right into the green card. I think the best thing to do is to start with a non-immigrant visa and test it out to make sure that you like it, because honestly, not everybody does.
Yeah.
So it's not that it's a high percentage of people that don't like it, but why do all that if you're not certain? And you won't really be certain until you're here.
Exactly. Now, that leads me to another question, which is, what can you do as a visitor here? If you're just coming as a Canadian and you're just visiting, can you do anything? Can you work? Well, you
Yeah,
answered,
so
but
when you come as a visitor, generally, the way it works is you're supposed to tell the Customs and Border Protection officer why you're coming. And so if you're coming for visitation, for travel, for relaxation, vacation,
Mm.
tell the person that. If you're coming for a business, you tell the person that. And so, and why do I say that? Because it's good to clarify when you're coming in, if you know ahead of time what you're going to be doing, and don't be afraid to say it. I'm coming here for business seminars. I'm staying for a month. I'm going to mix it in with vacation in the West, but I have this seminar and here's where I'm going. I have all the details here, because then they can classify you as a business visitor, right?
That's right.
You don't want to come in and be like, I'm just coming for vacation, and do something completely different, because then if you get caught lying, then you now have a situation where they could deny your entry. So I think being truthful is the best thing. And knowing ahead of time what you can and can't do, like you just said. So as a business visitor, you can have business meetings, you can sign contracts, you can negotiate contracts. The thing you can't be doing is operational duties and taking a salary, right? So you can't be hiring and firing people, managing operations. So, it's normal that all the time people come to meet with a US company to talk about some project they're going to do, and then they leave. That's not what we consider doing work. We consider that being a business meeting, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So let me ask you, what are the easiest ways for Canadians to live and work in the United States?
So the easiest would be to obtain a non-immigrant visa, and there are many non-immigrant visas. I don't know exactly how many, but they start with letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and they go all the way down to like W or something like that. So there are a lot of options. But within the employment and investment, generally, I would say the best one is the E2. So that is an investor non-immigrant visa. And it essentially says if you invest a substantial amount of money into a US company, usually that you own, that's going to have some employees and have some operations and is going to produce enough income for you to survive, then you can apply for an E2. So it's nice because it's very wide open. You know, being Canadian, you have that ability because we have the treaty that allows you to get that visa. And so you could do a health spa, you can do a consulting company, you can do basically almost anything under the sun. So it's nice.
When you say substantial, what amount are we looking at? Minimum.
So substantial is not written into the law. So, and it changes over time, and it's different depending on the post that you're applying at. So a substantial investment in the UK at the US Embassy in London is different than the substantial investment in Toronto.
Okay.
And it's constantly changing. So, but you're generally talking like $200,000 or more. And then over time, like if someone sees this video 5 years from now, it'll probably be 300,000 or 250 or something like that, you know?
Yeah. It's
You know,
dynamic.
we used to say, 100,000 or more, or 10 years ago or so. And could you potentially get one for 100,000 done? Maybe. But the lower amount that you go, the higher scrutiny the officer puts on the application. So the more you can put in, it alleviates the need. It alleviates a lot of the scrutiny and allows the officer to focus on the real fundamentals of the business and whether they think this is going to be a good investment, fit the E2 requirements, right? So I hesitate to really give you like a number, but I think it's easier to say it's not $1 million.
Yeah.
You don't need $1 million to do an E2.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Now, let me ask you, this is a question I get asked a lot by my clients is, how can I obtain a green card?
Well, first let me step back and just say there are two other really good non-immigrant options. So one is the L visa, and this requires if you have an operating business in Canada, and then you open an affiliate business in the United States, you can essentially transfer yourself to the US company to open up that branch. You can also transfer your employees, like your key managers, executives, you can transfer them over to kickstart your US operations. So the L visa is one that we use a lot for Canadians as well, but you have to have that operating business in Canada. And I usually like to see like 8 to 12 employees minimum in Canada, and then a plan to have a similar amount of people over time in the United States. So if you've got a business, but you're a solo practitioner in Canada, it's not going to work. But if you have an operating business that has like 10 or 15 or 20 or more employees, we need to be thinking, is L an option?
Yeah.
Because the nice thing about L is it doesn't require a specific amount of investment like the E does. And then the other option that a lot of Canadians use is the TN visa. It's a professional visa. So there's a list of, I don't know how many, but around 30 professions. It's based on USMCA, it used to be called NAFTA. And essentially, Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans can go cross-border in those three countries in these professions in an easy way. And so this is a good option for somebody who is like an engineer, computer systems analyst, mathematician, accountant, etc. So you have a degree normally. Some of them don't require a degree and require certain skills, but generally you have a degree, which I think is a 3-year degree in Canada. Usually here, it's usually a 4-year degree, a bachelor's, right?
Okay.
And then offer of an employment from a company that you don't own and control. So where the E and the L, you can be the owner, the TN, they don't want you to be really the owner, right?
Yeah.
And so you just kind of are looking at, who's in front of me, what is their profile, whether they own or not businesses, what are they doing, who are they coming to work for? And then you've got to line these different options up. So
Okay.
that's just what I'd like to say really about non-immigrant visas.
No, and that's great. So we have the E2, the L1, and the TN.
Yep. And there are more.
And there are more, but those are, I guess, the most commonly seeked visas, right? When clients come to you.
For Canadians, I would say definitely.
Okay. So how about the green card?
So on the green card side, on the immigrant side, so there are essentially two paths to it. One would be if one of your family members is a US citizen already. And so generally, if you're a US citizen, you can bring your parents, you can bring your spouse, and you can bring your children. You can also bring your brothers and sisters, but the brother and sister application is very long. I think it's like 14 years.
Wow.
So it's nothing fast. But the spouses, the children, the parents, a lot faster. So there's the family path. That's one way to become a green card holder or a permanent resident.
Mhm.
And then key thing is, once you're a permanent resident for 5 years in the United States, if you're spending a majority of your time here, you may be eligible to apply for US citizenship. Okay. So that's the path. Non-immigrant, immigrant, 5 years, and then apply for citizenship. And as long as you have good moral character and you're not, a criminal, usually the citizenship applications are pretty freely approved. Now, coming back to the green card option, so you have the family option, and then the other path is employment and investment. And in employment and investment, there are 5 main categories. They're called EB1, EB2, EB3, EB4, EB5. EB1 is broken up into 3 subsets. EB2 has 2, EB3 has 1, EB4 has a bunch. It's a catch-all. It's like religious visas and things like that. And then EB5 is investor visa. So it's not as expansive as the non-immigrant side, but it's a lot more clear because it's only really 5 main branches of it.
Okay.
So generally, just to go quick, within the EB options for green card, you have one that mirrors the L1A. So if you're already on an L and your company is growing and things are stable, you have a potential path through the EB1. It's called the EB1C.
Okay.
You have one for people with extraordinary ability, talent visas. We didn't talk about that, but there's a mirrored one on the non-immigrant side. And then another one that's highly used is called a labor certification. So this is where it's kind of like the TN, where you don't own and control the company and somebody's applying for you for a permanent position at a US company. So that's called a labor certification, where the company has to test the market and make sure that there are no available US workers. And if there are not, and you meet the profile, then they can hire you. Problem with that is it takes like 3 years.
Okay.
So then the EB4 I discussed, and then EB5 is where you invest. Essentially, it's like $1.8 million that creates 10 jobs within 5 years. And if you invest that money in an area that's rural or an area of high unemployment, they cut it in half. So like $900,000 or so. They're constantly changing the investment amounts. It used to be 500 and now it's 900, and it was 850 and now it's back up. So
yeah, they increased it to 800,000. Unfortunately.
Yeah, so it's like bouncing around, but essentially you're giving that money to someone who's going to create a massive development and create the jobs for you. Create 10 jobs within 2 years, and then they attribute those jobs to you, and then you can get the green card through that. So really the same thing as the non-immigrant. When somebody comes in for a consultation, it's looking at, okay, what is your profile? What is your capacity to invest? Do you have offers of employment? Do you own and control these companies? And then that is what drives what the best option is for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that leads me to another question, which is, Can a Canadian buy property here in the United States?
Definitely. Like we have, I don't want to say we don't have any restrictions on people buying property here, because for certain countries there are. But in Canada, for Canadians, you can buy a property. You can buy it in your own name. You can buy it in the name of a company. You can jointly own it with your spouse. You can jointly own it with your children. You can jointly own it with your friend. Yes, you can freely buy real estate in Florida and generally in the United States.
Okay, excellent. Now, what are the tax implications of moving from Canada to the United States?
Okay, so from a high level, and I'll start off by saying, because at the start you said that I'm a specialist in tax. So I'm not a specialist in tax. I'm more a general corporate attorney
Yes.
and business immigration attorney. And then within our firm, we also do commercial litigation and real estate transactions. So those 4 areas. So, but being a corporate attorney and dealing with that in immigration, I'm always meeting with the client and their accountant and their tax attorney, and usually the accountant in Canada and the accountant here, right? And helping everybody walk through these issues. So I'll just deal with it from a high level as I understand it. So
Yes.
generally, there are 2 main types of tax. You have income tax and then you have inheritance tax. So if you invest in the United States into, let's say you buy property in your name,
Mhm.
or you buy property through a company, whether it's an LLC or a corporation or a partnership, right?
Mhm.
And or you just own shares of, let's say you own shares of a company that like operates a gym, for example. That's owning property in the United States.
Okay.
Then that property becomes subject to inheritance tax in the United States because it's located here, right?
Mm.
And you own it, you're a foreigner, and certain rules are attributed to you. So usually the rules around inheritance tax on US assets for foreigners is very harsh. But because of the US and Canada tax treaty, it's a lot more flexible. Now, the way I understand it, and it's not a guarantee on how it actually works, but the way I understand it is, so we get about a $14-15 million exemption in inheritance tax in the United States as American citizens and in permanent residents. So that means if I pass away owning $10 million in assets, no inheritance tax for me to transfer that to whoever I want, right? But if I own 20 million in assets, the first 14, 15 is exempt. Anything above that is essentially a scale that goes up to like 40%
Okay.
to transfer that property to whoever it is.
Mhm.
For foreigners, the general rule is you're only exempt up to $60,000, which is super scary,
Oh,
right?
that's a big difference.
Yeah. Now there are ways to deal with that because, as a foreigner, the way to block that is you can have it owned through, you have a US company, but then that's owned by an offshore company. So let's say you have a British Virgin Islands company that owns the US company, and boom, that blocks inheritance tax for foreigners right there.
Okay. So
You have
keep,
to do it right, and you have to get the right advice by a
yes,
tax attorney and your accountant, right?
that's right.
But for Canadians, there's some nice rules where the US says, all right, we'll give you your $14-15 million exemption, but on a pro rata basis based on how many assets you have here compared to other places. So as an example, if you have $1 million worth of assets in Canada and $1 million worth of assets in the United States, that means you have 50-50. That means you get 50% of the US exemption on your US assets. So if you had $1 million, you'd be covered. That's how I understand it. It may be wrong. You want to check that with your accountant and tax advisors, but it's a nice thing because it makes it a lot more it makes it a lot more palatable for Canadians and other people. But at the end of the day, there's ways to get around it anyways for foreigners, and it's not illegal. It's totally normal. And you report everything to the IRS here. And so you just have to, as you're going through this process, make sure you're talking with the right
The right.
cross-border accountants and tax advisors.
Mhm.
Someone like me, if you came to me, I would be pushing you to work with a tax attorney and the proper accountants. And I would be talking to your accountant in Canada and your accountant here, and I would be double and triple checking that everybody's on the same page before we make this decision. Because once you solidify ownership, sometimes it's hard to change.
Yeah.
So, or it could cause a tax implication to change.
Yeah. And that's where you have to be really careful. And just going back to what I said at the beginning, aligning yourself with the right professionals is critical in any transaction that you do. So,
Yeah. So that was the inheritance side.
Mhm.
Then there's the income side. So from an income tax perspective, the general rule is, so as a Canadian, you're only generally, first off, you're taxed on any of your US based income. So if you own a property that you're renting, that's US based income, that's taxable in the United States. That's easy to get, right? Or let's say you own shares in a gym, you invested with your friend, and that's producing income, that's US based income because the gym is located here. Now, let's say you move here, now you're getting a salary here, now your US salary is taxed here. That makes sense, right? So all of your US source income is taxed here. Then, the moment that you start spending essentially a majority of your time in the United States, there's a tricky rule, it's called the substantial presence rule, but essentially you move here, right? And I can actually explain the rule. It's actually pretty simple. I'll do it in a second. But the moment you have what we call substantial presence in the United States, then now you're taxable on your worldwide income in the United States, which sounds really scary.
Mhm.
But if you're ahead of time planning with your accountants for that, up front, you're doing the things you need to do to show the US government. So, for example, oh, yeah, I know I have to declare my Canadian income here, but I'm paying tax in Canada, and here's the tax that I paid. So I should get a credit, right? So at a minimum, you're getting a credit for what you paid abroad. And then with the tax treaty, it's going to eliminate even certain overages. So, but you do need to ahead of time be planning with your US accountant and telling him or her, okay, this is what I own.
Yeah.
I have corporation that operates a trucking business in Canada. Here's what it's called. Here's who owns it. I have a limited partnership, family limited partnership. Here's what it owns, all those things. And then ahead of time, they're going to be doing things to potentially make changes before you become subject to having to report everything in the United States. So it's a very easy thing if you're doing it ahead of time. When you're doing it after you've already been here, you can't change things that have already been solidified.
Mhm.
You may be able to change it for future years, but the current year, you're stuck. So it doesn't mean that you're always going to be in a bad situation, because generally you get that credit for what you paid abroad. It's just that you want to make sure that you can avoid any pitfalls ahead of time, and you can do it easily if you just meet with an accountant.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's easier to plan ahead of time so that you don't try to figure out things last minute and make mistakes or, put yourself against the wall, right? So planning and aligning yourself with the right people is critical for sure.
Yeah, and so just on that income test, so the substantial presence test, the way that it works is, um, I believe it's 183 days. Well, I mean, you have to check and make sure, but I think essentially it's, if you meet this test, which when you count all of it up to 183 days, then you're taxable this year. So what they do is they count all of the days that you're in the United States this year. They count a third of the days last year, and then a sixth of the days the year before that.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Okay.
You add those up, and if it's above 100, 183 or above, I think that's the number you have to check with your accountant, then you're taxable on your worldwide income this year. So like as an example, if you do 150 days this year, last year, and the year before that, that's going to be 150 plus 50 plus 25, you're going to be over 180,
Yeah.
right? And the magic number is like 120, 121. So like if you stay at like 120 every single year, you'll never have substantial presence in the United States as a non-immigrant. And so a lot of people that are really savvy and that they don't want to report things here, they really count their days and they try not to get close and they try to keep it around 100. But don't let it scare you. Again, talk with your accountants because there are other things that you can do. There's a rule called closer connection. So you can ask, even though I have substantial presence, this year I had less than 180, and I'm really actually tied to Canada still. So you should really look at me still as Canadian because I was really only here 150 days. I'm not here. I have my family there. My church is there. I'm a golf club member there, all these things. I was really just visiting, right? And
Mm.
so your accountant may be able to make those arguments, or your tax attorney, and get you out of that regime. Because even though you may not be, let's say, taxable here, just having to file the entire return here in the United States is expensive because now you have a US accountant trying to sort out everything you have in Canada or wherever else, right? And just reporting that stuff is expensive, because you need a good professional that understands these things. It's not the regular run-of-the-mill accountant.
Yeah, for sure. They really need to know their cross-border.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, let me ask you, just switching gears a little bit, how do I sponsor a family member to come to the United States?
Yeah, so there would be two ways. Like if you're a US citizen, you can bring your spouse, children, parents. You can bring your brother, sister if they are willing to wait like, a decade and a half.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I think people should do, even though it's so long. Time flies, And if you'd have done it 2, 3 years ago, it would be 2, 3 years less, And
Yeah.
never know that it could speed up at some time.
Yeah.
So it could also get very much longer, but you don't know what's going to happen, and time flies.
Yeah. Just
Um,
get to it.
yeah. Also, green card holders, obviously, they can bring, their spouse and their children, but they can't bring their parents. They can't bring their brothers and sisters.
But one thing I
So
wanted to mention, sorry, John, is that I know with the EB-5, when someone is investing in a project, they are allowed to bring their family and their immediate family and kids that are under 21. That's also a question I always get asked by my clients as well, is like, can I bring everyone? It's yes.
okay, on any non-immigrant work visa and any green card, you can always bring your spouse and your children that are under 21.
21.
When
Okay.
your children become 21 or older, then first of all, for a non-immigrant, they can't come on your non-immigrant visa. Now, for an immigrant application, uh, if they're like 30, they're out. Now, depending on when you file your immigrant visa, you're able to lock in like a pre-21-year-old date and then use that. It's a very tricky rule called the Child Status Protection Act. So on the green card, you're not always cut out if the kid just turned 21 because maybe you can lock it in a little earlier. But but if they're already like 25, 30, it's not going to happen,
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you become a US citizen later and you want to bring those children, they can come, but there's a little bit more of a wait time because now they're over a certain age and things like that. So um, that's the family side. On the work side, so for example, you can bring, let's say you do an E2 visa, right? And you create a business. Let's say, I just keep saying it, but like a gym, and or a spa, and you come and you want to bring your son who's 30 to help you to manage it. Well,
Yeah.
technically, he's Canadian. With the E2, there's 4 types. You can bring an investor, which is a person who has 50% or more and has invested the money. You can bring an executive, a manager, or a person that's essential to the operation for the US company. So generally, we try to avoid essential because most positions are not really essential. Most positions you can just get someone locally. But you can bring any Canadian because you're Canadian as a manager or executive of your business. Now, you do have to show why you need a manager, why you need an executive, and then also things need to make sense with their resume and their profile and their experience. But you can line those things up a lot of times and maybe bring your sibling or your cousin or whoever to work with you on your US business with your E2. It could also be that they're working at your, and it happens a lot. Families work together.
Yeah.
Everybody's working on the business that has 30, 40 people in Canada. They're managers and executives, and you transfer them on an L, you know? So the thing that I always tell people is you should plan for yourself. You shouldn't plan for other people, because all it does is make it more complicated. And it makes it so that you are like ruining your application. You know, you need to come here and establish yourself, show the US government that you have a business that warrants bringing more people, and then bring the people you want to bring that make sense.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes complete sense. Now, what happens if I am here and I overstay my welcome on my visa?
So if you overstay your visa, don't contact me, because I will not help you. But essentially, just don't do it. Just say no, you know? Don't, if somebody puts that bird in your ear, don't do it. Leave and stay compliant, because the moment that you're not compliant, you're ruining your chances for other good options in the future. And it's just much better for you to leave and follow the rules and come back properly later.
Yeah.
Because you could play games, and the next thing you know, you get deported, or you go to leave and you overstayed, you go to come back, and they just don't let you in, and you never come back to the United States, which is silly. Like, nobody wants to not be able to go somewhere that they want to go, you know?
Yeah.
Like, just like you want to go to, maybe you want to go to Europe next year, or wherever you want to go, you don't want to be blocked from going somewhere because you just simply didn't respect the immigration laws. So I would say that it's very serious. It's not a joke. Don't listen to people that talk lightly about it. And if things don't work out, leave ahead of time. And I always say leave a couple days ahead of time if you're flying out, because what if your flight gets canceled?
Yeah.
So I always say leave 2, 3 days ahead of time, so that if something happens, and you can get the next day's flight.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Now, before we wrap up, I have one final question before we get to our chat. But what are the options for dual citizenship between Canada and the US?
So I'm a dual citizen. In the US, we do not have a prohibition on holding more than one passport, like certain countries do. Like, I know Germany does, and certain other countries do. Um, I don't know if Canada has that restriction or not. Um, but essentially, I'm allowed to hold two passports and be a citizen of both countries at the same time. So that's just like a general answer. And from a Canadian perspective, I'm sure an attorney could weigh in and tell you the ins and outs. There's different tax implications too, and I know that for Canadians, especially when I think it's different from me because I came here when I was younger, but Canadians like you who've built up, assets and investments in Canada, and then you come here, if you eventually permanently come here, I understand there's some sort of like exit tax in Canada,
Yes.
which is technical. So there's that happens. But I think one thing I want to point out about that is I want people to understand that you should not be scared of that, and you should be just planning with your proper advisors. Because some people are telling Canadians that don't spend too much time there because the exit tax is going to hit you, which is funny to me, not because I'm a Canadian tax attorney or a Canadian accountant, but because I have many Canadian clients, and never one of them, let's say they come here on an E for like 8 years, never one of them have ever came to me and said they're freaking out because they had to pay an exit tax when they didn't really exit Canada.
That's really good information, because I actually know a family that didn't move because they were so concerned about that. So that's really good to know, John.
I think that, generally accountants and attorneys, we're always telling you the risks, but I think you need to align yourself with somebody who understands the risks, but will tell you also reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to find, and it's really hard to find someone that can especially accountants and tax attorneys. There's never a right answer, and they want you to pick,
Mhm.
And so finding the right accountant, and I could definitely recommend one in Canada, and finding that type of person who can say, hey, let's find solutions, because this is a business need for you, right? Like, let's just find solutions. I think finding the right people, if somebody says, don't do this, get a second or third opinion too. Maybe I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
don't just like listen to one person if they're telling you something so grave like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to get to some of the questions that we have here from our chat. And one of them is, what type of cost can I expect to pay in trying to obtain my visa?
So the visa, so the costs, the main cost is the attorney. And so that is going to vary. So an attorney who's located in Iowa, who's working from home, is going to be cheaper from a New York-based attorney, New York City-based attorney, and also cheaper than a Miami-based attorney, right?
Mhm.
And but there are kind of like standards, out there that we understand, like kind of like market rates, but it just really fluctuates. Like even within Miami, there, for an e-visa, someone might charge, $6,000, and someone might charge $25,000, right?
Wow, I haven't
But
heard 6,000.
yeah, it depends. Like, I don't know how, but for some reason, Italians are able to negotiate great e-visa rates with their Italian US based, attorneys. I don't know how, because they come to me and they're like, well, this guy says I'll pay 3,000. And I'm like, good, go with him,
I haven't
'Cause
heard that.
I don't know how they negotiate these things.
No.
But essentially, you're going to be paying easily 10K plus on a non-immigrant visa, 15 to 20K plus on a green card, and less or more, and it depends on the person. I mean, I know people who were charging 12K for e-visas 10 years ago, you know, and
Mhm.
those same people are charging probably 20, 25 right now. And I mean, you're paying for experience too. You're paying for
Absolutely.
somebody who, knows what they're doing, and maybe they can command a higher rate because they've done 1,000, 100,000, or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
Um, and so it really varies across the board. Generally, the family options are going to be much cheaper than the work and investment options. Now, TN visas and the L cross-border visas, because Ls you can apply at the border just like TNs for Canadians, those are a lot cheaper, because they're a little easier to put together,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of attorneys that are comfortable with that type of application, and they'll charge a cheaper rate. Um, but generally, or kind of like the numbers I said, and it goes up every year,
Yeah.
10, 20% with inflation. And we all know inflation right now is easily like, 10%.
Yeah.
So there, so 10, 20, 30% each year, these rates are going up, and over time they're just going up. So if you watch this in 10 years, it's going to be like 40,000, 50,000,
So the moral of the story is do it now.
Yeah. And EB5s are the most expensive. Someone could charge 30 to $50,000 easy.
Mhm.
Um, and even more, I'm sure more. I mean, people were charging 30,000 10 years ago for EB5s.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the type of application, where the attorney is located, and their experience, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. So, John, at this time, I want to thank you so much for sitting down with us and, giving us all this amazing expertise and advice. I personally, as you know, you played a pivotal role in my family's life, and this is why we are able to live here in the United States. So thank you. And this is why I also wanted to bring you in, because you did what you said you were going to do. So thank you. And
Thank you very much for saying that. The reason I like what I do is because, well, like I said, we do litigation in my firm, which I can do, but I don't like as much as doing corporate work and business immigration, because it's very positive, and you're
because
helping somebody do something positive instead of you know, having basically a mental jujitsu fight all day with like 10 different people.
Yeah.
So I really like, you know, helping people. I really like business because I was a consultant, and I also have a business degree and an MBA. And so I just like, you know, being a consultant is what makes me like being an attorney, because if you've ever worked with a consultant, is they have a lot of opinions about how things should be done. They'll tell you how to do it, but then you got to be the one to run it. That's what I still do, you know. I still just have a bunch of opinions. I tell you how you need to do it, but you need to do it, right? So I do a certain portion of it, and then you carry it the rest of the way because you're the business owner, you're the investor, right?
Yeah, that's true. So, and this is where I invite my audience to, reach out to John and I if you have any additional questions that we were not able to answer today. John's information is going to be displayed in our YouTube channel, and we can always arrange for a one-on-one so we can see where you might need guidance and where John and I could assist you. So along with my dedicated team of Canadians that are here to assist other Canadians, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel for additional information that will help you. I put up a lot of educational information there, so feel free to join and like. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.